Okay, I'd like you to take a look at this text right here. It says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagofen. In English, that translates as, Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine, which of course means wine. So today we're going to talk about wine in the Bible and why it's very central, and why a religion would have a prayer to thanking God for wine, but also something you say every time you drink wine. Before you drink it, you thank him. There aren't many other religions with such an explicit thanks to God for wine, nor are there many in which wine plays a central role in every sacred ritual, every single week in the home, in the Kiddush, and once a year it is actually required to get more or less drunk. On Passover, you have to drink 4 glasses of wine in the course of the ceremony. That's pretty much enough for me. Nor is there, to my knowledge, any other religion that requires wine to undergo an official rabbinical supervision to be certified as kosher, at least for Orthodox observant Jews. So the relationship of Judaism to wine is overwhelmingly positive, so much so that I hope it will become apparent eventually how widely Christianity diverges from this opinion. On the one hand, inventing a sacrament using wine, which of course wine is indispensable for Christianity also, but also it introduces a certain ambivalence toward alcohol, which in our own day leads some religious people to prohibit it altogether, or at least to try. And in the case of the Mormons and Seventh-day Adventists, wine is actually forbidden. So the place of wine in this whole Judeo-Christian tradition within the Bible is kind of strange and intimate at the same time, and also paradoxical. And I would argue that this is the heritage which we have largely inherited today in the 21st century. We clearly love wine, but we are a little afraid of it, and we are worried about what it does, or at least alcohol in general. So let's start at the very beginning, or a few pages after the beginning. As you know, there's no alcohol in Eden. There's no killing there. There's no work of any kind. And so there really can't be any alcoholic beverages, right? At least, picking grapes and crushing them and letting them ferment would involve work, and that doesn't really happen in Eden at all. There's no labor. Labor only comes after Adam and Eve are expelled from Eden. And in fact, as we mentioned a few lectures back, the first time anyone makes wine is Noah, right? And he's the one who drinks too much of it and gets drunk. He's the first person to plant vineyards. And as I mentioned, also geographically, this makes a lot of sense. Mount Ararat, which is where the ark ends up, is actually directly adjacent to the place where the oldest archaeological finds of making wine have been found. So that makes perfect sense that he would have discovered wine there and planted vineyards. And of course, he drinks the wine. He doesn't quite understand how much of it he's supposed to drink, so he gets quite drunk, and in circumstances which I've never been able to quite explain, he gets naked and is lying there naked in his tent. And I guess this is a warning to the ancient Hebrews that wine, while a gift, can also be dangerous, because what happens thereafter is kind of strange and something I've never really been able to make sense of. His son, named Ham, sees him naked and goes and tells his 2 brothers. And the 2 brothers say, okay, let's come back with a cloak. Let's walk in backwards so as not to see him, and then let's just cover him up so he's not embarrassed. And I guess Noah was mad at the first son for not having done that himself. But how would he have known if he's just walking in? He wouldn't expect to find his dad naked and drunk. But in any case, Ham is cursed from that point. And his descendants, the Canaanites, are cursed to become slaves to the descendants of Noah and his other children. So it's kind of a weird punishment. I've never quite understood that. One scholarly account of in the commentaries I read said that to uncover one's nakedness was a biblical kind of code word for meaning to sleep with someone, which is why Noah curses him, and that doesn't make any sense at all to me. Um, but I do know that after the destruction of Sodom, after um, Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt, right? Because she's not supposed to look back, and she does anyway, and she turns into salt. Lot's daughters say, "Uh oh, this is the end of our line," because our father, can't reproduce and make sons and whatever. So Lot's daughters do something very strange, and well, of course they think everyone's been destroyed. So they get him drunk, and they both sleep with him in order to preserve the family line. So strangely, in the Old Testament, the drunkenness and a loss of consciousness and screwing someone while they're drunk and not knowing it, that's in Genesis, and in this case it's a commendable thing because they've saved the line of humanity. And the Moabites and the Ammonites are supposedly descended from their offspring, which is it's a really bizarre story, admittedly. So, but I have to say, in most of the Old Testament, if you look for references to wine, and they are, of course, all over the place because this was their beverage of choice in this area, it's entirely positive. There's really very little negative to be said about wine in the Old Testament. Think of, for example, Psalm 104. Thou makest grass grow for the cattle, and green things for those who toil for man, bringing bread out of the earth, and wine to gladden men's hearts, oil to make their faces shine, and bread to sustain their strength. And so wine is just one of these gifts that God gives to humans to be used freely as a regular part of the diet. And equally importantly, it is also a sacrifice. Now, think about how we've been talking about sacrifices, what they mean, how they're a way of communicating to God. And in terms of sacrifice, the text says, "Thou shalt bring for drink half an hin of wine for an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord." So, in other words, they are considering wine as a pure food that can actually be offered along with an unspotted calf or a certain amount of wheat, and it's destroyed. And this God likes. He appreciates this act of reverence toward him. There's also a story in Judges 9 that says, once upon a time the trees came to anoint a king. And they, among the types of trees, and they go to the olive tree, and he says, "And what? Leave my oil by which gods and men are honored?" So the olive tree doesn't want to be king of trees. And then they go up to the fig tree, and he says, "What? And leave all my good fruit behind?" He doesn't want to be king either because he loves bearing fruit, I guess, for people. And then they go to the vine and they say this, "Then will you be king over us?" But the vine answered, "What, and leave my new wine, which gladdens gods and men, and to come hold sway over the trees?" And then they go lastly to the thorn bush, who says to come under his shadow. And in any case, it shows that the Israelites don't have any particular stigma against using wine, right? It's part of their daily meals. It's part of their nutrition, and it's considered good food, right? Wine also figures in a very interesting way in the, I guess we have to call this an erotic love poem because that's really what it is. It's called the Song of Songs. It's a dialogue between a bride and a bridegroom, maybe allegorical as a love of an individual for God. Who knows? I think otherwise. I think it's really a good dirty love poem. But let me read you a little piece of this to give you a sense of how wine plays a part in it. The bridegroom tells his bride, "Your navel is a rounded goblet that shall never want for spiced wine. Your belly is a heap of wheat fenced in by lilies. Your two breasts are like fawns. That I don't quite get, but anyway. And later he says, may I find your breasts like clusters of grapes on the vine. The scent of your breath is like apricots, and your whispers like spiced wine, flowing smoothly to welcome my caresses, gliding down through my lips and teeth. He also says, I have eaten my honey and my syrup. I have drunk my wine and my milk. Eat, friends, and drink until you are drunk with love. So it's the whole poem is filled with just fruity metaphors and vines and wine and spices and perfumes. It's a lovely, lovely love poem. But the more dour proverbs, I think, do offer a little bit of corrective against consumption. For example, 21 reads this: wine, it says, is an insolent fellow, and strong drink makes an uproar. No one addicted to their company grows wise. Or, in other words, don't drink too much, right? He that loveth pleasure shall be a poor man. He that loveth wine and oil shall not be rich. Meaning that these are expensive things, and if you spend too much money on them, you'll never save your money. But it's not saying they're bad in and of themselves, right? So they do. So the text, obviously there are many different authors of the Old Testament, and some of them do have a sense that people may overdo it. And that may detract from, in this case, wisdom. You lose your sense a little bit. And of course, wealth, right? You may spend too much on it if you love it too much. But there's really no stigma against partying per se. And in fact, not only that, but God commands it. It's part of your it's necessary. In Deuteronomy 14, God instructs people about what a tithe means. And this is it's kind of a tax. But it says that every 10th part of every crop, firstborn animals, and wine is consumed in the presence of the eternal your God in a place consecrated to his name. He also says if that place is too far, convert it to money and take it to a chosen place, and then spend the money on anything you want: cattle, sheep, wine, or other intoxicant. I don't know what other intoxicant could mean, actually. Or anything you desire, and you shall feast there in the presence of the eternal your God and rejoice with your household. Now, this is a very important ritual. God is commanding that you drink wine and feast on this occasion. It is essentially a thanksgiving. And I know we have a Thanksgiving, and in fact, it's if at all, it started by Puritans in New England, because they are looking at the Old Testament specifically and saying we ought to have a Thanksgiving. And what God is doing is commanding people not only to have fun and party and have a festival, that's what this is, a feast, consume a lot of food and drink, but also to invite the priests. These are the Levites, the class of priests, and also offer food and drink to widows and to strangers. And what this is considered is in Hebrew is called a mitzvah. It means a good deed, something that God wants you to do. It's good. And you can see why this is good for building community and, for all of the kinds of festivals we've been talking about thus far, and drinking, why they bring people together and act as social cement to help them adhere. And again, as I said, our Thanksgiving is a secular holiday that really we don't start celebrating it in the United States until after the Civil War. And there was it's the so-called first Thanksgiving of the pilgrims would have been like this Old Testament one, not the modern turkey and cranberry sauce that we have nowadays. And I should mention something else, because I'll come back to it later in the course, is that the other side of a Thanksgiving, as far as every festival you also have a fast. And the ancient Hebrews would have a ritual period of atonement. What that means is you are kind of being sorry for your sins, and you're telling God, look, I'm going to give up food entirely for a whole day. This is on Yom Kippur. And also drink. And so you can't, and just to show you that I'm really contrite about all the bad things that I've done, and I want you to know that I'm going to suffer to let you know. But there are also fasts that are communal and public. So before a battle, if there's a crop failure, if for some reason people perceive the wrath of God to be upon them, they will actually stop eating communally and they declare a big fast. And in fact, the early pilgrims in New England did this also. So that, looking at the Old Testament, also they thought, as for every Thanksgiving we also have to have a penitential fast to show God we're very seriously sorry and we won't do this stuff again. And of course, individuals do them also. Remember, David sees Bathsheba naked and sends her husband to the front in war to be killed, and then he has her way with her, and he feels really, really awful afterwards for having messed up. So he fasts and puts on sackcloth and ashes on his head. But just realize that the Hebrews have ritual periods where eating and drinking is very important, but also these fasts where you abstain, but it's a short period and it shows that you're very, very serious. Again, communicating to God, right? Um, and so abstention also could happen. There are other kinds of fasts. It can mean rejecting delicacies for some reason. We find people living very simply. For example, Daniel finds food and wine when he goes to the court of Nebuchadnezzar, who's the emperor, and he said, I'm only going to eat vegetables and water. And after 10 days, he feels better and he looks better than everyone else there. So this, I don't want to suggest that this is all just a matter of party on or party off. There are actually very subtle differences and many different messages, obviously, in the Old Testament, because there are many authors. But again, in the point that I want to make in light of all of this is that in the ancient Hebrews did not really have an ascetic tradition. By ascetic, I mean a lifestyle that is very, very simple and usually abstains from meat by and large, and sometimes alcohol, and punishes the body. And the idea is to make your spirit stronger. You punish your body, and of course, monastics in Christianity are ascetics. But there is an official day of fasting, as I mentioned, is Yom Kippur, on which you atone for your sins, 24 hours of penitence, and blowing the shofar, the tuba of Zion, is what they called it. But there's nothing like we'll see later on in Christianity with the calendrical fasting that goes on during Lent and on Saturdays and during various times in the year. There's in which you abstain from wine. But there's one little passage in Leviticus where God warns priests not to drink before entering the tent of meeting. I'm not sure what that means, but it's there. Otherwise, they can drink all they like. The priests do drink, and it doesn't seem to be believed that that's going to impair them in any way. Okay, but there is one very interesting practice in the Old Testament that I'd like to bring up, because this is unusual, and it's a special vow that a person will take to become something called a Nazirite. Okay, don't confuse that word with Nazarene, someone who comes from Nazareth, like Jesus. Nazirite is a different word. And the word actually in Hebrew means to be set aside, to be a ritually clean, pure individual. And to do that, you do a few strange things. You don't cut your hair. So everyone understands what you're doing. Presumably everyone else cut their hair regularly. A Nazarite will not. And you take a vow to abstain from wine completely, never even to touch grapes, never to go near them. And you can do this for a set time. You can say, I'm going to be a Nazarite for a year, or you can declare it for life. And a Nazarite, there's things that they shouldn't do. They can't go near the dead. They can't set foot in a cemetery. And in the book of Numbers, 6, God explains to Moses what this special vow means. He says, when anyone, a man or woman, make a special vow dedicating himself to the Lord as a Nazarite, he shall abstain from wine and strong drink. These he shall not drink, nor anything made of the juice of the grapes, because of course we know it ferments immediately, right? Nor shall he eat grapes, fresh or dried. Not sure why that. During the whole term of his vow, he shall eat nothing that comes from the vine, nothing whatever, shoot or berry. Now the real question is here is, why would a person abstain? What's, if there's a positive attitude toward wine, why abstaining from it? Is it going to make you give you a special vow? Um, and clearly, if wine is a gift, it's used in sacrifice, it's not considered something that corrupts you. Why would these people take a holy vow to abstain? And I don't think at the root of this there's any idea that it makes them stronger, more spiritual, or that alcohol somehow distracts them from their devotion to God. I think it is because alcohol, and of course cutting your hair and dealing with dead people, is what's normal. That's what everyone else does. Those are daily activities that mark the life of every Hebrew person. So this is a ritual that more than anything makes you distinct, makes you set apart. That's what the word means. And distinctive in a special state, so that when you go around people, they always know, oh, will you have a glass of wine? No, I don't drink. And, oh, your hair's long, you're a Nazarite. So I think that's the real reason. Not that the wine is going to corrupt the person in any way, but that it makes sure that they are distinct and separate from the rest of people. It's a ritual separation, because if everyone is drinking ritually every Friday, in fact, they can't partake of it. They go away from this. And biblical commentators have disagreed whether this is something a vow a person takes when they do something really bad. It could be whether they are atoning, or whether it's a person who's just decides, I want to be a Nazarite and be really holy. And the other very strange thing is, people can actually become Nazarites today. It's discouraged very highly because the only way to end the vow is to make a special sacrifice in the temple, and the temple doesn't exist anymore, right? It was destroyed in 70 AD. There's only one wall left of it. So if you take a vow as a Nazarite, there is no way out of it. You're a Nazarite for life. And the other strange thing about this, apart from the abstinence from alcohol, is that some people are made Nazarites in the womb. Before they're born, they're consecrated as Nazarites. The most famous is a story in Judges 13. Let me tell you this weird story. So a guy named Manoah had a wife, and she was barren. And a guy stops her on the road and says, oh, by the way, ma'am, you're going to be pregnant and you're going to give birth to a son. But you have to abstain from wine and strong drink. And when the boy is born, he will be a Nazarite. So while you're pregnant, don't drink wine. And presumably everyone did. And so the idea is, when this baby is born, he will never have touched alcohol, even in the womb. Okay, and the stranger tells her, don't cut his hair either. And he says the reason is because he will be the one to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. He is a special consecrated person. And it turns out that this guy who stopped on the road was an angel, of course, giving a message to his wife. And the boy, you will maybe recognize his name, is Samson. Okay, and what happens to Samson, of course, is he has long hair, he has superhuman powers, he wins battles for the Israelites, and as you probably know the story, the way it ends at least, is that Delilah tricks him into revealing the source of his strength. And he says, it's my hair, it's long hair. And so of course she cuts it off, and they eventually capture him. To torture him, they poke his eyes out, and then the people, I guess they don't realize what happened. His hair grows back, and then the Philistines want to keep him around to fight for sport. And what he does is, he's standing there in front of the columns. He can't see anything, but he feels the edge of the columns, and he pushes them down, and the entire temple comes down and kills everyone, and he destroys everything. So, but again, let's get back to the alcohol connection here. In any case, I don't think there's any implication that abstaining from alcohol somehow is the source of the strength, right? It just sort of sets you aside. It makes you ritually unusual, and people will recognize you for being such, because you're because what weird person would not drink wine with everyone? So I think it is safe to say also, in the history of this special vow, I think John the Baptist was probably also a Nazarite. Um, in Luke, he says of his birth, he shall be great in the sight of the Lord, and shall drink neither wine nor strong drink, and he shall be filled with the Holy Ghost even from his mother's womb. So it's very much a story like the birth of Samson. And John the Baptist, of course, is the one who announces that Jesus is coming and baptizes him, right? So the more confusing question, and the one that historians really have always wondered, is whether Jesus himself took a Nazarite vow. There's a very similar sound of the word Nazarite to Nazareth, and Jesus being described as a Nazarene, right? That may just be a coincidence of the sounds of the words, but Mark has him, the Apostle Mark has him say, "Verily I say unto you, I will drink no more of the fruit of the vine until that day that I drink it new in the kingdom of God." Now, that may be a certain point in Jesus's life where he says, "I'm not drinking wine anymore," and maybe he's taking a kind of vow of abstinence. But on the other hand, Jesus performs miracles that involve wine all the time. He makes water into wine, in fact, for parties. There's wine at the Last Supper. He drinks it. This is my blood. And that's the end of his life. So if he had actually taken that vow, well, then he's lifting a glass of wine at the end and breaking it. But there are other confusing things. Like, for example, at one point he's contrasted with John, who drinks no wine and eats no bread, and he is called a glutton and a drunkard because he eats and drinks wine. Now, again, we'll turn to this question in a moment when we get to Christianity, but before we get back to Judaism, let me just mention there is actually one religion that considers its practice to be essentially Nazarite. These are people who do not cut their hair and do not touch alcohol. They are considered descendants of the Lion of Judah, and a one of the tribes of Israel, I think. You probably heard of these people. I'll give you a guess, but it's the Rastafarians. They take a Nazarite vow. I guess marijuana is not considered, part of that vow, but they don't drink wine. So the Old Testament mentions wine a lot, but it never actually demands that people consume it. Those rituals actually date from after the Old Testament was written. And the first and most important one is the Sabbath. Every Friday evening at sundown, a ritual takes place, during which the Kiddush, during which the bread is blessed and broken, candles must be lit, and wine in a special cup must be blessed and drunk. Okay, it's a necessary ritual that you do every Friday night at sundown, and then the Sabbath is the day of rest, of course, on Saturday. Usually the wine is put into a silver goblet. It will contain a revi'it of wine, that's 5.46 ounces. That's almost a standard pour. 6 ounces is a standard pour of wine. And it is drunk standing as people bear witness to keeping God's commandment to honor the Sabbath and promising to perform no work. And what that means is not even lighting a fire, not just completely resting that day. So it's not really a drink to loosen you up for the day off. It's something much more complicated than that. It's actually a deal. You're making a promise, okay? Exactly as if you were cutting a deal with a friend or writing a contract. In this case, it's a formal deal. It's called a covenant. A covenant is an actual promise you make between humans and God, and the way to seal that promise is with a glass of wine. And you're saying, look, I'm swearing on this wine. I promise I'm not going to work for this next day. I'm going to keep the commandment that you gave me, and I'm going to drink on it. Okay, that's, I think, what's really happening, because it's not really enough to, one glass of wine passed around and drunk is not going to do much, but it's consecrating the act. It's making it sacred. Okay. Um, there is, however, a more explicit drinking ritual. This is called a seder. Okay, a seder, or seder, is what takes place on Passover. It's a ritual that dates till much after the Old Testament. It actually commemorates the Exodus from Egypt, though, and of course the Book of Exodus is the second book of the Old Testament. But it's actually practiced as a ceremony from the time. I hope this doesn't get too confusing, but it's from the time when the Hebrews are ruled by the Greeks. Okay, in the wake of Alexander the Great, he left kingdoms behind. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids were the ones who ruled in Syria, which included the Holy Land. So at this point, the Greeks are ruled by the Hebrews are ruled by Greeks called the Seleucids. Okay, and there are some strange things that happen during this seder. Okay, there is a glass of wine that must be set out for the prophet Elijah, and a door is left open. And the what's said is that if a stranger shows up asking for food, you invite him in, and there's a cup already poured for him, and it has to be there. Okay, because that's Elijah, the prophet, coming back for a meal, and so you need wine for that. And then some other very interesting things happen at the Passover. Instead of sitting upright, everyone reclines. Now you remember, think back just a lecture or two. What other kind of event do you recline? Remember, these are Greeks. They speak Greek, in fact, at this point. Um, Instead of bread, you eat an unleavened matzah. Okay, it's a flat sort of cracker to commemorate when supposedly the Hebrews escaped from Egypt. They didn't have time to let their bread rise before baking it, so they have a flat bread, unrisen. They also eat bitter herbs. They dip it in salt water twice, and there's a Seder plate where various things on there commemorate certain things in the story of Exodus. There's a neck bone of a lamb for sacrifice. There's various things like that. Something called moror, which looks like a mortar that they would have made temples with, and so on and so forth. But the part that concerns us is that in the course of the ceremony, every person there is expected to drink 4 glasses of wine. Okay, 4 6-ounce glasses of wine is a bottle per person. Okay, so, and if you pour an 8-ounce glass like I do, that's about a bottle and a quarter. That's certainly enough to get you perfectly happy. Modern rabbinic commentary states that the 4 glasses each represent one of the 4 forms of redemption. One, that the Hebrews were taken out of Egypt, being rescued from their service, being redeemed, and for being taken as a chosen people, or being taken as a nation of people. Is so they all represent something very important. You can't leave one out. You can't just have a sip. You drink the whole glass of wine. So if you look closely at this whole ceremony and the time that it takes place in Greek-ruled Holy Land, there are features that really would lead you to think that this is actually a symposium, right? People are reclining, they're drinking wine, and in fact, there are questions that are asked. The youngest person there has to say, why is this night different from all other nights? And the head male philosopher, or symposiarch, if you want to put it that way, answers them and gives them answers. It's very much a dialogue like you find in Plato or even Xenophon. Ongoing commentary takes place during the whole thing, so it's not like a regular meal. You really are going through this ritual ceremony of a text of a play, sort of like a dialogue, and you're drinking throughout it. And I don't think it's coincidental that this ritual is sort of coalesces exactly at the point the Jews become Hellenized. And there's actually a couple of words that are make their way into the ceremony that definitely come from Greek. The word afikomen comes probably from the word epicomium, the things that you eat after the meal, and that's a piece of matzah that you hide, and the kids go and find it. But that's pretty good evidence that this is a kind of symposium. So, but in a certain sense, what's the alcohol? Why are you drinking here? In a certain sense, you're drinking to all of these four things that God did for you, right? You're toasting them in a sense. Thank you for delivering us. Thank you for making us a nation. And here's to you, God, right? And on a certain level, you're agreeing to live up to them. You're going to say, you're saying you've made us a people. We're going to drink to that, and we promise we're gonna live up to your expectations. It's like sealing the pact with a drink, also, isn't it? It's like swearing an oath. It's like saying, God, you did it for us, and here's to you, and I will we promise to obey your commandments and to uplift your purposes. Um, so let's see. Let's take the story further just a little bit. Let's see how Passover and the wine drinking figure historically in a religion that comes out of Judaism. Okay, the two are very, very closely related. Um, and I'm going to, of course, encapsulate the history just for the sake of our course. I don't need to go into great detail, but to give you a sense of what happens is this guy named Joshua. In Hebrew, it would be Joshua. We call him Jesus. Okay, was a Jew. He was not unlike other people of his day, was a faith healer. Remember, he heals sick people, raises people from the dead, wandering around, and a miracle worker, right? I mean, that's his career starts as someone who is performing miracles for the people. And he shows up in Jerusalem with a handful of apostles and gets in a lot of trouble for stirring up the masses. At this point, the Jews are actually ruled by Rome. Like the Romans had taken over the Greeks and imposed a governor on them. And they still had a king, sort of puppet king, Herod, but the Pontius Pilate is the governor at this point. And the point when Jesus shows up, it is the week of Passover, and the Jews, being ruled by Romans, they really don't want to antagonize their Roman overlords, and the Romans really don't want to upset their Jewish citizens because they're good taxpayers, and they obey. Remember Jesus saying, "Render unto Caesar what Caesar's, pay your taxes." He tells his followers. So of course, they get it out of the mouths of fish, but still, they pay their taxes. And Jesus gets this really big following, right? I mean, he shows up in Jerusalem, and they're waving palms, and everyone is praising him, and this puts everyone on edge. It puts the Pharisees, the priests in the temple, on edge. It puts the Roman governors on edge. It puts everyone says, "What's going to happen? This guy is trouble." And presumably what's happening, and I want you to know that there are people who disagree about the actual date of what's happening, because there are four different accounts of this. So, but in any case, Jesus and his disciples are celebrating what is probably Passover. Okay? And they are doing the symposium. They're reclining. They're drinking wine. They're eating matzah. Of course, this is never depicted in modern paintings. If you think of Leonardo, he gets everything wrong, right? It's a flat table. They should be on a triclinia. They should be drinking with chylices and so on and so forth. But the point is that Jesus, at one point in the ceremony, turns to everyone, and they don't seem to be paying any attention to him. And he says, you guys, for all you care, this bread could be my body, and this wine could be my blood. So you know what, folks? Next time you eat and drink, remember me, okay? Because this is my body and this is my blood. Is what he says. Okay? They have no idea what he means, okay, by this at the time. And note also, there are four different versions of this. The synoptic gospels they're close, but John differs a little, so people argue maybe it was Passover. Some people say no, it's the day before Passover. It's not really important for our purposes, but it seems like it is Passover. What is important is that the how much wine have the apostles drank, folks? 4 glasses each, right? They go out in the garden after a bottle each, and they are drunk, and they fall asleep, and they just, blowing off steam, I guess. This is the point, however, when one of these apostles, this is Judas Iscariot, points out Jesus to the authorities, and everyone else is drunk. They can't stop him. They fall asleep. So, well, in any case, well, what happens is they take him in, they arrest him, they say, who you calling yourself the king of the Jews? And he says, I didn't say that. But, people have claimed that. And he doesn't cooperate with them. They're upset with him. They pass him back and forth between the governor and the Pharisees, and it's a total mess. And as you know, of course, he is crucified. They asked the governor asked the crowd. It's a tradition to pardon some prisoners before for Passover, and they don't want to pardon him. They think that the Romans really want to get rid of him, so they say, "Go ahead and crucify him." And so, in any case, what we have here is basically an unfortunate situation of a Jewish leader getting in trouble with the authorities and becoming crucified. Okay. There is no idea of a separate religion at this point. No one thought of it being different from Judaism. That is actually invented by Paul. He invents the religion of Christianity. Paul was actually also a Jew. Saul, he had a conversion experience and changes his name and decides to stop persecuting Christians, but to be one of them. And it's Paul who really interprets all of these events in light of a new religion. And you can really say new religion not only because he gave him the name Christos in Greek. It means anointed. It's the same word as Messiah, actually. Moshiach in Hebrew means to be anointed with oil. But there's a tradition that the Messiah is going to come and lead the Jews to freedom and have another kingdom. But again, let's get back to the point of wine. It's Paul really who explains what happened in that Last Supper. The bread and wine, in fact, become the central ritual in all Christian denominations. The Eucharist is what we'll refer to it as, or Holy Communion, whatever you want to call it. It is a ritual of sharing bread and wine in a public ceremony, which is a sacrament. Okay, we'll discuss further what a sacrament means, but it's a ritual that has to be performed by a priest. Most sacraments are rites of passage: baptism, marriage, ordination, unction when you're dead. So they signal your passage from one state of being into another, but they are also something which gives you merit. In other words, when you perform the sacraments, you get merit points, let's say, and those get you into heaven. So participating in the Eucharist, eating the unrisen bread, or wafer as it comes to be, and drinking of the wine gets you saved, gets you into heaven. So it's something you have to do. You can't get into heaven if you don't do this sacrament. Drinking wine, or at least a sip, this is the point, is required for salvation. You cannot get into heaven if you've never had the sacrament. You go into limbo, and I guess you have to listen to Caribbean music and go into the pole and all that, right? Never mind. So now it's not exactly clear to early Christian commentators what's going on in this ritual. And in fact, it takes more than 1,000 years for them actually to decide what's going on in this bread and wine. What did Jesus really mean when he said, "This is my body and this is my blood"? Well, it was decided in a Lateran Council in Rome in 1215 that when Jesus said, "This is my body, this is my blood," he was being literal. Okay? Now, what this means, in other words, it is actually his blood and his body. And how do you explain that? It doesn't look like blood, doesn't taste like bought flesh. The way they explain this is through what's called the doctrine of transubstantiation, and what that means is that the substance, the actual essence of the thing, is changing from wine to blood, to his actual blood, but the accidents, the external form, the way it looks and smells and tastes to us, actually doesn't change at all. So those accidents remain the same, but the substance changes. So it may look like bread and wine, but it's actually flesh and blood, and his real flesh and blood, and it's a miracle. Um, and to consume it, you gain merit. Now, what I mean by that, how this operates, is that by participating in the sacrament, you get forgiveness of sins. Okay, that the technical word for this in Christianity is grace. Like, when you have an overdue library book and there's a grace period and you can give it back without paying the fine. It's forgiveness of sins, literally grace. It doesn't mean being live and beautiful and graceful. Okay, that's just a weird modern English understanding of the word. It originally means forgiveness. So to participate in the sacrament, you get forgiveness. And I want you to think of this in light of where we began the course, really, in terms of entheogens, right? Because you are literally ingesting the God. Okay? You take him in, and it changes you. Something you go from being a sinner to being clean, to being washed of sin, to being forgiven, to be given this grace, even though you don't really deserve it. You're participating in the sacrament and you're getting forgiven. And other very interesting things happen. And this is all Paul explains all of this stuff. He says, you'd wonder, well, most religions, the leader is killed. That's the end of it, right? And Paul says, no, actually, what has happened is that normally we used to sacrifice lambs on the altarpiece and kill them and splatter the blood, and that was to atone, to obviate the sin of our own sins. And it pleased God, and the sacrifice, was burned and smoke went up. But what happens now is Jesus himself became the sacrifice. Instead of lambs being killed, Jesus was killed. And that's why he's called the Lamb of God, right? Is that Jesus on the crucifix replaces the lambs on the altar in the temple. And I bring this up here because we're going to have to come back to this. When we get to the Reformation, when we talk about Christianity and alcohol, this is one of the big arguments. It's actually the thing that separates Protestants from Catholics to this very day. The question will be, is this really wine changing to blood, or was Jesus speaking figuratively? I mean, he does speak figuratively all the time. He says, I am the vine, right? At one point, it doesn't mean he's really a vine. He speaks metaphorically and in parables all the time. So we'll see later on, reformers may say, well, this was just meant to be a memorial. Eating flesh and blood is cannibalism. So in any case, we'll return to this topic. But suffice to say, the point I really want to make here is that wine is required for Christian worship. It is required for salvation. You cannot get into heaven without at least a sip. Okay? And that's until very, very recent times. Some denominations deny that. But let's also examine for a moment the general attitude toward alcohol among Jesus and his disciples. Let's look at that more closely, because there are people who argue that Jesus performed miracles. He did turn water into wine, but they argue it was actually grape juice. It wasn't fermented yet. I think the argument is slightly ridiculous, even apart from the fact that grape juice itself will not last for very long without turning into wine, right? In fact, the stuff I've got here that we crushed yesterday is now fermenting. My office smells like a winery. But in any case, people contend that he might have served wine, and that happens all the time, but there's no scene in the New Testament where he is described as actually drinking it, including the Last Supper. He says, this is my blood, but it never says, and he drank the wine. I think there's enough circumstantial evidence that he did, of course, but But the very fact that, it's there all the time, and he uses wine making as metaphors. There's in one of the parables he says, neither do men put new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break, and the wine runneth out, and the bottles perish, but they put new wine into new bottles, and both are preserved. um, and Actually, the original is wineskins. It's not bottles, but you can certainly use old bottles over again. But you get the point. Is that there are metaphors and parables and everything all over the place that he speaks of wine. There's also a very interesting moment where Paul tells Timothy explicitly, "Drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and for thine often infirmities." And I think it's pretty clear that he's thinking of the medicinal virtues of wine. He's thinking about Galen wasn't alive yet, but he's thinking of Hippocrates and the whole, humoral system, and of course the ability of wine to disinfect water. So I guess Timothy gets stomach aches, and he says, "Stop drinking water. You're going to get sick on that. Drink wine instead, and for your infirmities." Um, so he may be saying, don't drink water alone, but mix in some wine to correct her, or he may actually be saying stop drinking water entirely. So people argue about what this means, but I don't. But he's definitely telling him have a drink, okay? And lastly, I guess I want to mention that the last book of the Bible itself, Revelations, is filled with all sorts of interesting, very frightening wine imagery. Let me read you just a little bit of this. This is 16. I know what it says. So another angel came out from the altar which had power over fire, and cried with a loud cry to him that had a sharp sickle, saying, "Thrust thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for the grapes are fully ripe." And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great wine press of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horses' bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. So this is the battle on the plain of Armageddon. This is the apocalypse. Okay. Let me read you just a little more. "Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon the many waters." This is about the whore of Babylon he's talking. "With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away into the spirit of the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication." So I think if we look at wine among the early Christians, like much of what had changed from apostolic times, the religion begins to take some very surprising turns. This is partly because the Christians had to define dogma. They had to make very clear why they were different from Jews. And of course, Jews as a chosen people, are closed. You can't become one. Christianity suddenly opens up to anyone who wants to convert. And and in the process of doing this, they also begin to invent a church. They begin to institutionalize the church itself, and build a hierarchy. Right, there are bishops and priests and a congregation to look after. But something that comes in about this time also, and it probably has earlier roots, but it plays a very important part in Christianity, is asceticism. Is this idea that you scourge your body, deny yourself sleep and food and sex, which are really, if you think about it, the biological imperatives of our species. We wouldn't survive without eating and reproducing and sleeping, but they stop doing those things, and quite often abstain from alcohol also. Okay, um, and for the very first time, we will see in the late antiquity and in the early Middle Ages, drunkenness becomes a kind of gluttony. It becomes a form of excess, in fact, a cardinal sin, something now that's going to get you into hell, not just give you a bad hangover. It's eternal damnation. So, as we will see, when we get to talk about some Christian theologians in the early Middle Ages, um, alcohol is suddenly not just stigmatized, but made a real enemy, a temptation, something that will lead you into other sins. And we all know, of course, your rational faculties are impaired. You can't drive as well. You do things that you perhaps wouldn't if you were sober. So, Evagrius Ponticus in the 4th century says specifically alcohol is a gateway to sin because it makes us susceptible to wrath. We'll be angry. We might beat someone over the head if we get drunk. To lust. We may, want people we shouldn't. To sloth. And certainly, when you get drunk, you lay around and don't want to do anything. To avarice. Makes us jealous of other people and makes us want what they have. Could be, yeah. Um, to pride, especially if we are buying really expensive, nice wine. It goes toot 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 toot. Look at me, I'm drinking expensive wine, and to envy. And this list eventually is codified. These are the cardinal sins. They're codified by Gregory the Great in 590, but we'll see that gluttony and drunkenness are the gateway sins. They lead to all the others in a way, and in fact, they're the most dangerous for that very reason. We don't realize when we get drunk that we're gonna maybe steal and maybe commit fornication and maybe kill someone in our wrath. So we'll see the Middle Ages puts a complete twist on this now. Alcohol suddenly dangerous. Okay, I'll see you next time.